didn't kill Bob soon, he'd be powerless and start to fail, never to rise again. Bob charged at Nutan with the swords. Nutan crossed his wrists again, but nothing came out. Instead, he got a slash across the chest, making Sheena cry out. Yellow mutated blood began to pour from Nutan's chest. Nutan tried to duck and dodge the blades, but his power was now rapidly fading, and he was getting cut and slashed more and more. Realizing that no more rays would be shooting out of his crossed Ultraman mutant arms, Nutan instead concentrated on trying to avoid the swords, kicking and punching the giant as he dodged aside. But he was so gangly and uncoordinated due to such a size that he was being cut more and more by the slashing sword of Bob. "We gotta get him out of there," shouted a crewman named Sergeant Storm, "or it'll be a death by 1,000 cuts." "I've counted 39 already," said Callisto with concern. A minute more into the fight, and most of the city was destroyed. Nutan's warning blinker was sounding full speed. He was now incredibly goofy and awkward looking, and Bob seemed stronger, albeit with a lot more gray in his beard now. Doug Davis, a crewman on Mutainia, pointed out that energy readings from the Golden Dome absorber seemed to be diminishing in power. When he reported it to the Mutainia crew, Callisto said, "Yes, it seems logical that would happen, since it is the one that is creating this giant. But unfortunately, Nutan seems to be losing energy a lot faster than it is." The Mutainia crew tried vainly. The Mutainia crew vainly begged at the ship's viewing screen, telling Nutan to quit fighting Bob and instead try to escape before it was too late. The swords of Bob became reabsorbed into his body. It was now using strong punches to blast and stagger the giant, weakening Nutan in the face before grabbing him by the arm and tossing him onto any building that still remained standing, creating massive death and destruction. "There's no way Nutan can beat this thing," said Callisto. "It's already over for him. He needs to be removed before he just brings more destruction, as Bob uses his body as a battering ram, as a battering weapon on that city." Nutan was now so weak he could hardly stand. Callisto said, "This is going to be a gamble, but they're going to have to absorb some of that energy we put into Nutan's body that turned him into Ultra Mutant." "You mean shrink Nutan?" shouted a frightened Sheena. "We need that energy to be diverted to our weapons. Hopefully it will be charged up. Hopefully it will charge up our weapons strong enough to divert Bob, allowing Nutan an escape." On the planet, Bob jumped up and delivered a sidekick to Nutan's chest, sending Nutan crashing through an overpass filled with cars and people that were trying to escape the city. They were so weak from the latest absorption that they couldn't escape through levitation. When Nutan staggered up, Bob lifted his fist over his head. The fist turned into a sword again. Right when he was about to swing down with the sword and chop Nutan in two, Bob's eyes widened as Nutan suddenly began to grow smaller when the beam from Mutainia came down and struck him. Bob smiled with excitement at his now shrunken opponent. Nutan looked about with fear. Suddenly, Bob snatched Nutan up in his arms and got to Nutan in a headlock with one arm while his right hand turned into a knife. Bob started carving on Nutan's throat, making Sheena scream out with horror. We've now got energy for a photon blast," shouted Jeff Long. "Direct it right in the heart of Bob," shouted Callisto. He cried out with horror, "What about my city?" Down the city, Bob continued to carve on Nutan's neck, making the loud, booming Godzilla-like roar as it carved. "Good thing Bob chose to turn his hand into a dull knife," shouted the crewman Doug Davis. The crew of Mutainia couldn't stand to see what was happening to their captain. "Get out of there, Nutan!" they vainly shouted at the view screen. "Forgive me for you," said Callisto. but Nutan is too important here. He then turned to Obakoba and shouted, "Fire!" And a bright glowing bolt of energy shot down out of Mutainia and struck Bob in the back. There was a loud sonic boom of an explosion, followed by tons of dust and sand that filled the air in a large cloud. The explosion of Bob killed just about all in a 2-mile radius. When the cloud of dust diminished, Nutan was standing 500 feet tall in the ruins of another mountain of dirt. A mountain of dirt formed right in the heart of the city. "Bob is coming back!" shouted Sheena. "It's hopeless," said Major Matt Mason, the non-mutated clone of Nutan. "Get Nutan out of there," commanded Callisto. As Bob formed, Nutan shrank. When Bob was complete, Nutan was back to his normal size. Bob walked over to the cowering Nutan, who was looking for a place to fly off to. Bob raised his huge sandaled foot over the wide-eyed Nutan and was just about to crush Nutan out of existence when suddenly Nutan was beamed back aboard Mutainia. The crew ran down to the transporter room to check Nutan out. "I'm fine," said Nutan, as his neck and throat began to quickly heal back up. "Thanks for using some of my energy to distract it like that. But what about Bob? Can we stop him from destroying the city with the reabsorbed energy?" Down in the city, Bob made a loud roar of the sentence in its native tongue that made it sound a lot like Godzilla. Its cap glowed a rainbow of colors. Those familiar with the glowing cap knew what that meant. Fuyu, who stayed on the bridge, turned away, knowing what it meant also. Bob opened its newly bearded mouth that was now gray, and the Godzilla-like spray it had for destroying cities for past rebelliousness shot out, catching city block after city block on fire. The giant Bob then walked about, kicking, crushing, and smashing what was left from the fight it had with Nutan, fanning the flames in the city with its giant, flowing white robe. Nutan fired down on Bob Mutainia fired down on Bob a second time, using a weaker bolt of energy, hoping that if it was weaker, there wouldn't be such a devastating explosion like the last time. But still, the same bomb effect occurred, destroying more of the city. When Bob formed again, Nutan demanded that they try using a phaser beam on it, but that was even weaker. But the same thing happened again, destroying even more of the city. "Weaken the phaser even further," demanded Nutan. But even though the beam was hardly destructive at all, right when it touched Bob, Bob exploded like a huge bomb and destroyed just about all of the city. But that was a weak phaser beam," shouted a discouraged, sad Sheena. Callisto shook his head a little, then said, "Strange. It's deliberately self-destructing, making it look like we are using powerful weapons against the inhabitants, Strange. It's deliberately self-destructing, making it look like we are using powerful weapons against the inhabitants of its Strange. It's deliberately self-destructing, making it look like we are using powerful weapons against it. Inhabitants of cities be damned. It's as if it's trying to get the Patamars to think we don't care about where or when we attack Bob, just as long as we attack him. No doubt, this is Bob's way of trying to create fear and alienation in the minds of its slaves toward anyone who might try to free them from it. And Bob suddenly came out of the ground again. Nutan just stood on the bridge. He shook his head from side to side also and said, "It's damned if we attack, and it's damned if we don't. We can destroy Bob, but in the process we just kill and hurt the innocent, being that it deliberately hides among them. No doubt it will forever now hide among them, making it so we kill its victims if we try to kill it in our attempt to free its victims." Like a cancer, said Obakoba. A sick, evil cancer. A few minutes later, it was hard to see anything due to all the smoke and fire. On Mutainia, the crew just stood stunned. They couldn't believe the recuperative powers of Bob. Nutan had failed horribly and caused the death of thousands of innocents in his effort to protect the city from such a hideously oppressive monster. Now, all the crew of Mutainia could do was watch